pleased I'm pleased that we've grown over the years to have a strong legal component, as well as chapters and fellows at law schools around the country. We started our speaker series several years ago in order to provide law students on university campuses with a perspective on issues involving anti-Semitism, especially in higher education. With COVID, the speaker series has moved online, where we've been having an excellent series of experts addressing various topics relating to anti-Semitism and the related topic of anti-Zionism. Today, I'm especially pleased to be able to welcome Mark Rotenberg, a vice president at Hillel International. Mark is one of the most experienced lawyers in higher education, having spent many years as general counsel at the University of Minnesota and at Johns Hopkins University. We have been very pleased, and I would say privileged, to have been able to partner with Hillel International and to work with Mark Rotenberg on a number of topics. You will not find a lawyer who understands higher education better than Mark Rotenberg. As part of the series, we've touched from time to time on issues of free speech and First Amendment. Those certainly come up time and time again. Related to that is the doctrine of academic freedom. That issue comes up when our students and faculty members are restricted in various ways from expressing their views in the classroom, in their scholarship, and otherwise. But it is also used sometimes accurately and sometimes inaccurately in a host of other debates and controversies surrounding our issues. So what we have found is that academic freedom is a technical issue that arises frequently and which is important for students, faculty, and others concerned with this issue to understand. Mark Rotenberg has trained some of our fellows on this topic before, and we find him to be an excellent expert on this topic. I, as I say, have felt privileged to be able to work with Mark Rotenberg in the past, but I'm especially pleased to be able to share him with you today. After Mark Rotenberg speaks, Aliza Lewin, my colleague at the Brandeis Center, will join the two of us to have some discussion and question and answer. To the extent that you, as audience members, have questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box at any time, and we will see what questions we can answer afterwards. But for now, I would like to turn to our guest and to welcome my friend and colleague, Mark Rotenberg.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you to the Brandeis Center for inviting me to speak with you this afternoon. Brandeis Center has been not only an important resource, but a critical resource in helping thousands of students in the higher education space across the United States who are increasingly facing a marginalization, exclusion, discrimination that can be addressed informally, but also on occasion needs to be addressed legally to make sure that our students are protected in regard of their legal rights, particularly under Title VI and the President's executive order on anti-Semitism in higher education. What I'd like to do today is briefly, for maybe 15, 20 minutes, outline some of the unprecedented situations that our students face in the college space now, given the the dramatic rise in hate and even violence against the American Jewish community that has unfortunately spilled into the college space and the digital media space that our students largely inhabit. I'll then talk a little bit about the doctrine, the principles of academic freedom, how they relate to First Amendment rights of free speech, and then highlight several key issues in this space that we need to confront and deal with at this moment. So let me offer some framing issues to begin with. First, and perhaps most important, is the now dominant hostile narrative on many campuses connecting US racial justice imperatives and initiatives with the Palestinian struggle against Israel. This ideological linkage has been circulating in far left circles for many years, but has now become pervasive and even normative on many campuses. And I say this with great sadness, because I was born and raised and have lived most of my adult life in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where George Floyd was murdered, and this racial justice imperative that is sweeping the United States, and especially in higher ed spaces, the fire was set, the kindling fire was set by his murder. And I feel very strongly about the need to address this. But connecting what happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I know a little something about what's going on there, personally, having spent most of my life there, and connecting that to what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, where I have also lived with my family, is a complete distortion of both situations. And we do ourselves no favor by allowing this kind of connectivity to become the dominant narrative by which we understand the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians. But this has become a pervasive linkage. Now, it is not limited by any stretch to far left rhetoric, and has now become dominant in many spaces. And I'll say something more about that. The problematic nature of caricaturizing Israel as a stand-in for white racism in the United States forces Jewish students to either disavow their connection with Israel, because who wants to be connected with white racism in the United States, as a price, right, for joining in racial justice and other progressive spaces, or becoming a pariah and becoming alienated from those opportunities and spaces. And to the extent that that becomes a written or formal thing, that is a legal problem that must be addressed by universities, by their DEI offices, by their offices of student affairs, and by their academic leadership. The second thing I want to point out is that Israel's recently demonstrated military superiority over Hamas dredges up a dark web of anti-Semitic tropes about American Jews as white, as privileged, as wealthy, people who can control our society and manipulate the United States government, and so on and so forth. And these are deeply embedded, historically based anti-Semitic tropes that get infected into the college space when the rhetoric is all about and focused upon Israel's military superiority over Hamas. A third point is that while there is much anti-Semitic activity driven from white nationalist sources, including on campuses and especially in the mountain states and in the South, most Jewish students are able to understand and negate those classic forms of Jew hatred. On the other hand, many of our students, including the majority of Jewish students who have little or no Jewish background or education or experience living or visiting Israel, have now faced a flood of what we call erasive anti-Semitism online and in social media spaces especially, that distort the current Jewish experience of Jews in the United States and marginalize and silence Jewish students' voices in defining and expressing their own Jewish identity and their diverse relationships to Israel. And the final thing I'd like to point out, and I'll get to this a little more in a couple minutes, is that our students have recently witnessed a wave of official statements by university departments that make inflammatory assertions about Israeli genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on, and that proclaim a very strident anti-Zionism and assert, and this is the coup de grace of these statements, that there is no other perspective on the conflict that is worthy of a hearing. These are anti-intellectual statements that restrain academic freedom and do not enlarge it. It's one thing for individual faculty, of course, to express their own personal views, either individually or collectively, about Israel and Zionism as a matter of academic freedom. But it is quite another for university departments officially to declare an orthodoxy of viewpoint on this hotly contested issue. And Hillel and the Brandeis Center are actively engaged at this time to protect the academic freedom of Jewish and other students and faculty, if I may say, who do not accept their academic department's newly proclaimed official anti-Zionism creed. I'll point out that my friend and mentor in this space, Carrie Nelson, former head of the AAUP, has written an incisive and very important piece in the Inside Higher Education blog, I believe, that is worth referencing on this exact topic. So let's turn briefly to a little bit about academic freedom, and I'll offer you some perspective on where it came from, how it relates to the First Amendment, and so on. Academic freedom emerged from a 19th century growth of American universities. If I may say, my former academic home at Johns Hopkins University was one of the centers for the beginnings of the articulation of academic freedom. But it began in the 19th century as a result of a new relationship between universities and the outside community. Throughout Western history and in Europe and in England and in the United States, colleges originated as bastions for the teaching of Christian doctrine and the teaching of other classical department activity like Latin, Greek, physics, astronomy, philosophy, and so forth. And these protected bastions where the faculties of these elite universities in Bologna, Paris, Cambridge, Oxford, William and Mary, Harvard, Yale, and so on, largely existed in isolation of the rest of the community, because less than 0.5% of people went to these schools, and very, very few people understood actually what was going on inside these schools. But with the growth of higher education as an important social benefit and value, and the Moral Act in the Lincoln administration that dramatically expanded the resources that universities could benefit from, universities began to be much more important to the communities in which they lived. And so boards of trustees that were not faculty, legislative mandates that were imposed not by academic leadership began to affect the university space. And you had the growth of land-grant universities and a dramatic increase in the number of students attending these schools who were not only the sons of wealthy people, but were being trained in the mechanical and agricultural and mining sciences and practices. And that's why you have the growth of hundreds of universities that have mining schools and schools of agriculture and engineering schools and various applied sciences. And then later, of course, after World War II, dramatically expanded into healthcare, nursing, and so forth, that required the faculties of these universities to protect themselves from non-academic interests that they felt, that the faculties felt, would distort their opportunities and range of academic missions. And so in the beginning of the 20th century, you had the articulation of principles of academic freedom, which were later embodied by the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom. And the Statement of Principles of Academic Freedom that were written in 1940, believe it or not, are still the normative articulation of academic freedom for universities in the United States. There have been various footnotes and various amendments and various nibblings at the edges, if you will, of the AAUP principles, the 1940 principles. But those principles are the normative declaration of what academic freedom means in the higher ed space in this country. And I'll in a moment, I'll read you a couple of sentences from that statement, because they may be surprising to you. At the same time, and I gave you a very, very superficial, race through 100, 200, 500 years of history there, which for some of you who have history degrees, you'll probably find that to be too superficial and distorted, but happy to talk with you about this stuff offline. At the same time as this was going on, the United States Supreme Court was beginning to evolve and elaborate the application of the First Amendment to the several states and apply First Amendment principles not only to the actions of the federal government, but to state action. And you began to see this in the opinions of Holmes and Brandeis and other giants of the early 20th century jurisprudence of the court. And by roughly the same time, the 1940s and 50s, the Supreme Court had stabilized an understanding of the First Amendment, which applied to state universities, meaning universities that were funded or controlled by the states. And you find in several opinions of the Supreme Court, dictum, but sometimes you could say holdings, that articulated the notion that universities, and by that I mean universities, faculties, and students, have First Amendment rights to express their viewpoints free from state restrictions. And that doctrine, the elaboration of the First Amendment in the higher ed space, exists coextensively with these principles of academic freedom, which were developed not by the courts and not by application of First Amendment values, but from the values of the academy, principally the elite professoriate of East Coast universities, who wanted the freedom to be maintained so that they could control their own research, their own classroom behavior, and their own voice, free from direction and restriction from non-faculty individuals, principally their boards of trustees and the legislature of the states. Now, how that applies in the higher ed space to private institutions is a somewhat more complicated matter, but I'll just give you the title of the answer, which is that most private universities try to mimic the values and freedoms enjoyed by the faculties of public universities. So for example, just to take one random example, the faculty of Harvard College, as smart as they believe themselves to be, thinks that they think they have the same First Amendment rights as UMass faculty, a few miles away. That's not exactly true, but they believe that to be true. And the most important point is that the administrations of these universities believe it to be true. And so they have assimilated the values of the First Amendment into their own understandings of academic freedom derived from a different silo and a different history, right, that are articulated in the 1940 AAUP principles of academic freedom. Long story short, we now have a general understanding of what First Amendment and academic freedom means throughout the country, regardless of whether they are public or private institutions. But for us lawyers, it retains a meaningful difference. Let me quickly talk about just 3 or 4 key issues and then open it up for dialogue and questions. There are very important and problematic issues related to faculty understandings of academic freedom. That they relate, number one, to individual faculty expressions of academic freedom and attempts now in the last 45 days to articulate political positions on the Gaza-Israel conflict as departmental positions. So one value here that we need to elaborate on is the problem of bullying and imposing an orthodoxy of understandings in the classroom, as opposed to the value that we must maintain of respectful academic environments that create and preserve academic space for a multiplicity of perspectives to be heard. And this is very important now because, as I said a second ago, we've seen a dramatic increase, hundreds of academic departments signing on to statements that, in my view anyway, dramatically restrict the academic space for students and scholars to express multiple viewpoints. I want to share with you now a couple of sentences from the Principles of Academic Freedom from the AAUP. Paragraph 2 of that AAUP constitution, if you will, for academic freedom, it's called the Statement of Principles, says, teachers are entitled to freedom in the classroom in discussing their subject, but they should be careful not to introduce into their teaching controversial matter which has no relation to their subject. Limitations of academic freedom because of religious or other aims of the institution should be clearly stated, and so on. And then it goes on. College and university teachers are citizens, members of a learned profession, and officers of an educational institution. When they speak or write as citizens, they should be free from institutional censorship or discipline. But their special position in the community imposes special obligations. As scholars and educational officers, they should remember that the public may judge their profession and their institution by their utterances. Hence, they should at all times be accurate, should exercise appropriate restraint, show respect for the opinions of others, and should make every effort to indicate that they are not speaking for the institution. Now, I would submit that this normative statement about academic freedom has been challenged severely by various statements of academic departments. And I'll share with you right now an important example of one of them. Can everybody see this slide? It's a statement of gender studies departments in solidarity with Palestinian Feminist Collective. And it is signed by literally hundreds, not dozens, but hundreds of academics and academic departments. And what does it say here? In addition to falsely mentioning the removal of Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, a raid on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and indiscriminate bombing in Gaza, which are simply false statements. The statement goes on to say, we do not subscribe to a both sides rhetoric that erases the military, economic, media, global power of Israel has over Palestine. This is not a conflict that is too controversial and complex to assess. Israel is using violent force, punitive bureaucracy, and the legal system to expel Palestinians from their homes and remove Palestinian people from their land. Now, all of these statements are inflammatory, and some of them are simply inaccurate. And the deeper question, of course, is whether these statements adopted by, and you see here all of these departments, department at Rutgers, department at Minnesota, department at UC Santa Cruz, department at UC Berkeley, department at UC Santa Barbara, department at Stony Brook, University of Illinois, UC Irvine, University of Connecticut, UCLA, Yale, Arizona, and so on and so forth, rest very uneasily with the articulation of the norms of academic freedom that I just recited. A second issue has to do with students. So that was faculty, right? A second has to do with students. The Supreme Court and decisions by the AAUP under the 1940 principles both protect academic freedom of students independently of faculty. Students have First Amendment rights too. And number three, and here's where a lot of the work that Brandeis and Hillel and other organizations undertake, universities have academic freedom. The Supreme Court has articulated that universities themselves possess academic freedom independently of their faculties and students to guide their own mission free from governmental control. And this, of course, came out most prominently in the affirmative action cases at the University of Michigan, Grutter and Gratz, where Justice O'Connor allowed the University of Michigan to some degree to engage in race-conscious affirmative action because she said the university could determine for itself, had an academic freedom to determine for itself how it would shape its student body to achieve its own particular academic objectives. So we have three principles of academic freedom here that have their source in the First Amendment and in AAUP guidelines. The freedom of the faculty, the freedom of the students, and freedom of the university. And one of the points that Aliza and Ken and I have been attempting to articulate for university leaders is that they have a First Amendment right and they have their own academic freedom voice to articulate what are the values that need to be maintained in this period of stress following the Gaza conflict. So this is an important issue. And the last thing I'd like to point out is that student governments also have been by the dozens passing official resolutions that impose an orthodoxy of viewpoint on this conflict. And the last thing I'll show you, if I can find it, is a example here from the University of Oregon. This is fresh off the press. I think it was just passed in the last several days. Can everybody see this? This is a statement by the Associated Students of the University of Oregon. And because it's brand new and particularly vehement, I thought I would share it with you. The University of Oregon Students Association vehemently opposed the genocide of Palestinians at the hands of the Israeli armed forces. And then it goes on to provide its own version of the history of the conflict, and then state the following. The Associated Students of the University of Oregon refuses to engage with this dialogue. The Israeli military is actively committing genocide and engaging with modern day colonialism. The umbrella of Zionism includes ethnic cleansing, This is not a war that one takes sides on, and so forth and so on. And so what we hear again is this same erasure of any possibility that someone in the University of Oregon student body could have a different point of view or could be a Zionist. Because to be a Zionist, according to the University of Oregon Associated Students, includes ethnic cleansing and genocide. These are the kinds of statements that are being officially issued by student governments that mirror the official statements that I highlighted about academic departments by faculty that operate to restrict and constrain academic freedom, as the Supreme Court has articulated under First Amendment principles, and the AAUP has articulated in its own statement about academic freedom. Let me stop here because I want to give an opportunity for Ken and Eliza, my friends, and the rest of you to chime in and ask some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent, as usual. I'm going now to introduce and welcome my colleague, Lisa Lewin, who is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center. She's a former president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and founding partner of the law firm of Lewin and Lewin, and she will join me in asking a couple questions. I also noticed that there are some questions that have been suggested by some of our distinguished audience members. I'll mention that the audience today includes not just our law students, but professors from a variety of disciplines, both in the United States and also Europe, as well as some prominent attorneys, a former president of the American Association of University Professors and others. I'm going to invoke, though, the moderator's prerogative of the first question, if I may, Mark. And I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on this troublesome example that you gave regarding the women's studies statement on the recent issue. When you showed it to us, you had just finished telling us about the extraneousness principle from the 1940 AAUP Academic Freedom Statement. And then you showed us the women's studies statement that clearly, as you pointed out, was controversial. It was filled with errors, presumably was extraneous to the field of women's studies. But what do you make of it? If it was extraneous within the meaning of the AAUP doctrine, what does that mean? Does it mean that it lacks academic freedom protection and therefore universities have flexibility in how they address it? Does it mean that it was an abuse of academic freedom? Does it mean that it should be addressed in a particular way? You mentioned that university presidents have their own academic freedom, and so they could correct the errors. But is that where they should leave it, just to correct the errors? Presumably that's something they could do even if this were not extraneous and even if it were not error-ridden. So I would just like generally to get your sense of, because we're seeing these statements now far more than ever before, just within the last few weeks. What do we make of these academic freedom principles that you've just explained? And what does it say about what university leadership should do to address them?
Yes, Ken, thank you for that multifaceted question. This is a very challenging area because it's now become so pervasive, really just in the past 45, 60 days. Under the normative and standard understanding of academic freedom as the AAUP has defined it, and I believe a reasonable interpretation of the Supreme Court's doctrine of the First Amendment as applied to universities, especially public universities. I think that university leadership, deans, provosts, presidents, chancellors have every right to repudiate, challenge, correct, modify, comment upon, however they choose to approach it. They have every right to intersect with these departmental statements. and they should do so for the reasons that I began to express about the effect of these statements on the climate of respectful academic dialogue and the goal of the academy that has been understood to, for a couple hundred years now, or at least 100 years. Whether they will do so, of course, is open to grave doubt. The overwhelming flood of these statements has created a situation where very few universities have spoken out. There are one or two examples. I don't want to specifically name them now because I don't quite have them in mind, but I have seen at least a handful of university leaders who have said, you can speak as individuals or even groups of individuals. You can express anti-Zionism or your hatred of Israel or your viewpoint, but you must do so in the context of the AAUP principles, which, number one, and most importantly, admonish faculty to say that they're speaking for themselves as individuals and not for the university. And this conflation of speaking as individuals with their imprimatur of departmental officialdom is where the problem really arises. So the brief answer is that I believe there's ample authority, but whether they'll do so is open to some doubt. And I would note that, again, I mentioned Professor Nelson at the University of Illinois. Kerry has put together, as I noted, an important piece on this that begins to express how universities could respond.
Thank you, Mark. Eliza Lewin.
Hi, thank you, Mark. There are so many questions, I guess. One is just following up on that. Well, while you talk about how you think the universities should distance themselves or use the university's own academic freedom to make clear that this expression, even by a department, does not reflect the university's position, and that those departments that chose to express it this way are not reflecting the university's position. But what about the faculty members? And I think this is what Carrie's piece gets to. What about the faculty members in those departments whose academic freedom has been violated because they disagree with the positions expressed? Or what about students in those departments who may disagree with the positions that are being expressed? What are their academic freedom, right? What rights? What can they do to try and protest what I gather really is a violation of their academic freedom?
Yes. Well, again, this is a really fraught area, and it's really cutting edge because we have seen interstitial examples. I think Brandeis Center and I myself, in working in the Hillel space, have received episodic, right, faculty member complaints about these things and implored us to help them with their academic situations when the department is taking such a strident anti-Zionist position. But this has now become a flood. It's affecting thousands of faculty in hundreds of departments, and this is something that we have to address systemically. So just to begin to slice into this, there are three levels of analysis. With regard to the tenured faculty, the faculty that have academic tenure under AAUP rules and their own university rules, those professors should feel free to speak out and dissent from the departmental statement if they wish to do so, of course. But this assumes a particular point of view, which many faculty have, that they disagree with these statements and don't share the perspective that's become this normative viewpoint. They have such protections under their tenure codes that they should and can speak with complete freedom on behalf of their own perspective. And they may suffer some consequences for that, right? The departments of the universities do have a lot of control over many financial, reputational, and academic opportunities, even for the tenured faculty. But they are in one box. The most vulnerable box are the non-tenured faculty of the departments, because they have no protection from the steps that may be taken by the department to implement and give meaning on the ground to these official doctrinal statements. And they can be terminated, they can have their class assignments taken away, their opportunities to present papers and manage or lead academic conferences can be restricted or precluded effectively by the tenured faculty because they lack tenure. The third group are the students, the graduate students who depend on these faculty for their opportunities in the profession, right? And undergraduates. And oddly enough, I would say, and this is obvious, this is subject to dispute, which I invite, of course. I would say that the undergraduate students have more voice and more opportunity to express themselves than the graduate students, because the graduate students in these departments are so vulnerable to the whims of the tenured faculty upon whom they must rely for their professional opportunities, that speaking out as a graduate student, I would say, is next to impossible. I'm sure there are graduate students and faculty who may disagree with me, but having been in this business for several decades, that's my own perspective. So I would slice this, Aliza, into those three categories: tenured faculty, untenured faculty, and students, and describe their varying opportunities to express themselves in this context in that manner.
That's really interesting, Mark. I'd like to follow up, maybe also fold in a question from Carrie Nelson, which you've, I think, partly anticipated already. He says, I think you might share with the audience your thoughts about what should be done about department-imposed orthodoxy. So I'm going to add that, but also let me react a little bit to what you've just said, Mark. Generally, I agree, although I'll tell you, I have seen over and over again students, both undergraduate and graduate, who feel intimidated to speak out because the professors have all of the power over them in terms of grades, in terms of scholarships and other things. Then there are untenured or adjunct or conditional faculty who feel they have effectively no academic freedom because they could be terminated. There are tenure track professors who have a little bit more security, but they are, after all, up for a tenure and feel they can't speak until they're tenured. Then they become associate professors who have tenure, but don't want to rock the boat because, of course, they want to become full professors. Then they become full professors and don't want to rock the boat because, of course, there are a certain number of endowed chairs within the department, and they're not going to get one of those if they rock the boat. Then they become the endowed chair, and then there are other things that they want, including status and prestige, as well as ability to be respected and have lunch with people and be invited to conferences. So they generally, in many cases, will be unwilling to speak controversially until they become emeritus. So then they retire. They've forgotten what the issues were that they wanted to speak out about, but they also have less power, and they want to make sure they can still have an office for when they occasionally come to lunch with the professors. So there are very, very few, if any, professors who have the confidence and the fortitude to speak out against, especially a statement that is joined by an entire department. That is very rare. So in that, and again, you can if your experience is different, but we have talked with so many people over the years who fall into those categories. So if a department chair is a department is making one of these statements, perhaps something that's outside of the AAUP standards because it's extraneous or for some other reasons, I think I've heard you say a couple things. One is that university leadership can use their academic freedom to engage and to say why they're wrong. But I think I might have also heard, and I'd like to see if this is what you're saying, that they can also, under certain circumstances, do more than that, and to say, listen, this is just inappropriate. The department should not be speaking on this topic. It is extraneous to your field, and it could undermine the academic freedom of your students or dissenting faculty members. Is this something that you think is appropriate, that you would urge on departments, and is that the way to go?
Yes. So I think there's a legal answer, and that a general counsel of the university would give, and then there's the political situation that deans and provosts and presidents and chancellors face at the moment. I think the most reasonable legal position is that the leadership of universities, whether they are private or public, now this does not make a difference in that regard, have the capacity, the legal right, if you will, to require these departments not to make such statements and to withdraw such statements if the university leadership has determined that they are inconsistent with AAUP academic freedom guidelines. And I would, if I were advising a university in that regard, I would carefully craft that more assertive view very carefully to hew within the principles of the AAUP academic freedom guidelines, that the statement is either extraneous or, I think more strongly, I think the stronger legal basis would be the one you just finally articulated in your comment, Ken, which is that they impose an undue restraint on the academic freedom of the rest of the department. And you did a very elegant job of getting into the category, the three very broad categories that I offered, with a more nuanced understanding, with which I agree, by the way. So that's how I would go about it. But that's the general counsel's answer, or the legal answer. Then there's the political question, right? And we just have to be frank and honest about it. How many deans, how many provosts, how many academic leaders, chancellors and presidents are prepared to take on the leadership of numerous departments, most of which are located in the humanities, some within the social sciences, and restrain their perceived right to engage in this kind of departmental orthodoxy. That's an open question. There are leaders in some schools who I think would say, yes, I have the practical capacity to do this, and thank you for your legal advice. I'm going to adopt this statement or this public requirement. But I'm fearful that in the present moment, maybe it'll be different come the fall. We're going to be asking academic leaders and institutions to do what they perceive to be practically impossible at this time.
Thank you, Mark. We've got about 7 minutes left. Eliza, did you have any other questions or comments, or should I turn to the Q&A queue?
So I was going to kind of tie in maybe some of the questions that were coming in from the Q&A. I think that when you talk about the administration and whether or not they will forcefully respond to some of these statements, it isn't part of the difficulty that these kinds of statements are filled with, as we talk about, falsehoods and errors. And yet administrators, as well as many in the general public who don't closely follow what's going on don't immediately recognize these statements at all as being filled with falsehoods and mischaracterizations, or what I would say many of them come very close to actually being modern day blood libels. And the question, like we had one question here from Richard Heidemann, who said, how have the anti-Israel movements been so successful in persuading academic departments to promote false and misleading information? And why have the pro-Israel movements failed to get these departments to reconcile the indisputable facts with their misleading messaging? And he asked whether this has to do with money. Is there money that's coming in that's leading to these kinds of conclusions? And there's another question that builds on that, which talks even also about faculty members who may be also publishing or signing on to this kind of false information. And how do we try to ensure that what they're signing on to is even academically honest, right? And can the university be going after them for publishing even things that are not academically honest? Otherwise, how does the university maintain its credibility as an institution of honest academic integrity and inquiry?
Yes, I mean, these are all really important questions. I would suggest that the one answer is sort of perhaps the first observation I offered at the very beginning of this meeting, which is that there is such a dominant and tight narrative existing in the bubble of these academic disciplines, connecting US racial justice requirements and imperatives with the Palestinian struggle against Israel. And within that frame, it is almost impossible to tease out the idea that there could be another point of view, because after all, if it's true that what we have to do in Minneapolis to reform the police department in order to provide racial justice for Black folks who live in the Twin Cities is the same thing as what's going on in Jerusalem in Sheikh Jarrah, there's almost no way out of that for pro-Israel and Zionist students or faculty or even administrators to come in and say, hey, you need to do something else. Because after all, it's critically important that America reform and change its relationship to Black people who have been the subjects of enslavement in this country for hundreds of years before the Civil War and Jim Crow and so on. And so it's really, really tough to cut into that and separate this back out and require the kind of objectivity and neutrality and academic freedom, because these statements specifically reference that. They say this is not a conflict. There are not two sides. We will not listen to other points of view, because they have framed the argument in these terms. So my own sense, maybe this is naive perhaps, but I would say it's not so much that there's outside money and influence here, although there is from certain Arab countries and other organizations that the Justice Department has occasionally prosecuted for supporting terrorist organizations. I would say it's less that than the frame, which creates a bubble of orthodox opinion. And you can slice into this in various ways. You can have a dean or a provost say, you reference ethnic cleansing, but when Israel took over East Jerusalem in 1967 for the first time, there were 53,000 Arabs living there. There are now over 300,000 Arabs living there. That's categorically not ethnic cleansing. Whatever else you may want to say about what's going on in East Jerusalem, that's not ethnic cleansing. When the Arab population has grown sixfold. You can say that as a dean or as a provost or as a president, but you're not going to get very far, because many of these academic leaders in these departments are going to say, you're quibbling over a detail or something like that. So I'm fearful that we're not going to be able easily to recover the narrative of a more traditional, deliberative, every side gets a fair hearing opportunity in some of these academic settings.
Mark, as our time comes to an end, I want to thank you for what you've taught us today and always, as well as for your partnership and that of Hillel International, and for what you do every day to fight anti-Semitism on college campuses and protect academic freedom. There's one more question that I'm going to read, and I'm going to answer it myself. The question is, would suing help? And what I will say is this. Sometimes it does, not always. These are not all fodder for litigation, but the Louis D. Brandeis Center is available to support both students and faculty whose rights have been violated. I see that we have both students and faculty on this call. If you believe that your legal rights have been violated, please feel free to contact us through the Brandeis Center website or either of us, Eliza Lewin or myself, directly. Again, Mark, this was excellent. Thank you everybody for joining in. And I want to let you all know that we will return in 2 weeks on June 23rd at noon, where we will have Orrin Gross, professor of law at the University of Minnesota, Mark Rotenberg's former university. Professor Gross will be speaking about Jewish studies departments and the rise of anti-Semitism. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Eliza. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.